Welcome, Bangers and Mash listeners. Today we're doing something a little different, or I should say I'm doing something a little different. Sometimes schedules are hard to coordinate. People get sick at inconvenient times, or people are on the road at inconvenient times. It's been a little tricky for JD and I to get together to record in the first half of this month, and I'm going to be going solo on this episode. In the comments, or on our email address, or on the Facebook group, let me know what you think of this approach, and hopefully it doesn't piss anybody off too much. I would prefer JD to be here, and I know he would prefer to be here too. I really want you guys to get 2 episodes this month. Earlier in May, a lot of people got excited. It was all over social media. People were saying, we're halfway to Halloween. Interestingly enough, the first time this month that JD and I did see each other, it was very dreary and rainy and overcast out, and we decided to stay in and watch old horror movies and horror trailers. We had a mini Halloween, not even realizing that that night was Walpurgis Night, which is the German Witches' Sabbath May Day celebration. I can't really say it's halfway to my Halloween, because I start celebrating Halloween in September, and nothing gets me more in the Halloween spirit like the classic Universal monster horror movies. We've talked about those films before on the Bangers and Mash show. Our very first episode was devoted to the Universal monster movies, and since then we've done commentaries about Frankenstein 1931 and the 1931 Dracula. The purpose of today's episode is to talk about some of the more overlooked Universal monster movies. It's Bride of Universal Horror.
Universal Studios Monsters, The Hunchback of Notre Dame. This is no Disney Quasimodo, my friends. The 1923 silent film starring Lon Chaney Sr., the man of 1,000 faces.
The first movie on my list here is widely considered the very first Universal monster movie. It's not truly a horror film. 1923's The Hunchback of Notre Dame, less a horror movie and more a period melodrama, or a gothic melodrama. Quasimodo is frequently featured next to Dracula and Frankenstein in merchandising and such, but the movie is pretty low on horror content. The first time I saw Hunchback of Notre Dame, I wasn't a huge fan of it. It's not fair to overlook Hunchbacks. Without it, there wouldn't be a Dracula or a Frankenstein. The Hunchback of Notre Dame was based off a book by Victor Hugo. The French title of the book translates to Our Lady Notre Dame. English title, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, is actually misleading. Quasimodo is not exactly the lead character. He is not in large parts of the film. Esmeralda the Gypsy Girl, her love affair with Captain the Guard Phoebus takes up half of the runtime. Victor Hugo, many of his books dealt with themes of social unrest, and that takes center stage in the plot often. Esmeralda's adopted father, Clopin, is king of the gypsies, and he plots revolution against France's apathetic king. His daughter falling in love with a noble doesn't sit well with the guy. The theme of haves versus the have-nots are never more apparent than in the scene where Clopin and his thieves storm Phoebus' party. The poor stand on one side of the ballroom, clothed in rags, and the rich are on the other side in elegant gowns. And you could even make the case that Quasimodo is a gear in the machine of the social hierarchy. He is almost a literal machine. His job is to ring the bells. Quasimodo is controlled by the film's villain, Frollo, who is a noble in the church. When Quasimodo is captured for Frollo's crime, Quasimodo is the one that's punished, publicly humiliated. Unfortunately, a lot of these potentially interesting themes are undermined by the conventions of the time. 1920 cinema, especially when you were talking about big budget films, and this was a big budget film for its time. It was one of Universal's super jewels. That was their term for a blockbuster tentpole release. Very heavy on melodrama. Differing from the novel, the movie version has a happy ending. Esmeralda isn't executed. She's rescued from the gallows. It's a theme Victor Hugo returned to in another book that was also turned into a Universal movie that I'll talk about next. Gypsy Girl was actually royalty who was kidnapped by gypsies as a baby, because Victor Hugo fucking hated gypsies. Problem is that Esmeralda isn't that interesting of a character, unfortunately. Patsy Ruth Miller is the actress, and she's lovely to look at, but the character is directed by the whims of the plot. Phoebus is a cynical womanizer in the novel, and he's transformed into a bland, romantic hero in the movie. Eventually, the story of class warfare gets lost amid the romantic entanglements and period grandeur. The book is very critical of the Catholic Church, and that's totally exiled from the feature film. Claude Frollo becomes a mostly kind man of the cloth. Many of his villainous actions are shifted to his brother, who I believe is a character created for the movie. I haven't read the book since the 6th grade. All of that is overlooking the thing people really remember about this movie, which is Lon Chaney as Quasimodo. Obviously, the makeup is extensive. He has makeup all over his face, and he carried, I believe, a 15-pound silicone hump on his back. He was incredibly talented at committing pathos through his body language. He's suffering on the pillory. Esmeralda comes to him, give him some water. It's actually a very touching moment. Another convention of the Gothic melodrama is that the Gothic grotesque, which Quasimodo is an archetypal example of, usually has to die at the end. And indeed, Quasimodo does die in the movie. And his last act before he passes is to ring the bells, which is celebrating Phoebus and Esmeralda's love for each other. Chaney was prone to overacting from time to time when he's sticking out his tongue and grasping with his hands. Without a doubt, his performance is the best thing about the movie. Hunchback of Notre Dame, not really a horror movie, but still visually spectacular. The sets are beautiful. I love Gothic architecture, and this movie's packed full of it. Ultimately, these elements sell me on the movie, even if the overwritten routine story doesn't. And I still need to see the Charles Lofton version. People say it's really good. I haven't seen it. So I just mentioned The Hunchback of Notre Dame is not the only Victor Hugo novel that Universal adapted into a silent film. The other movie I'm talking about is The Man Who Laughs. And this film was directed by Paul Linney, who previously made The Cat and the Canary. Very good film. Probably the best old dark house movie. And that film was full of expressionistic atmosphere. Unfortunately, The Man Who Laughs is not as heavy on that really impressive atmosphere. There are some cool images. We see a Iron Maiden torture device appearing out of the darkness. That's a cool moment. There's a wonderful sequence where somebody comes across skeletons hanging from gallows in an ice storm, which is pretty cool. And if you're a fan of Frankenstein, I think some of the sets for that movie were recycled from this one. They do look similar. My big issue with The Man Who Laughs is the plot, steeped in the melodrama of Victor Hugo. The plot of this one is King James II tortures a noble to death before selling his son to gypsies. The gypsies physically deform the boy. They carve a permanent rictus grin into his face. And through a convoluted series of events, this boy, Gwynplaine, adopts a blind infant and meets up with a homeless philosopher. And 20 years later, all three of them are working in a traveling circus. The little blind girl's name is Dea, and when she grows up, she's in love with Gwynplaine. Because she's blind, she doesn't know that he has this hideous grin permanently carved into his face. Gwynplaine does not believe himself to be worthy of love. And a duchess, played by Olga Benklanova, who was later in Freaks, takes interest in Gwynplaine and brings this missing noble to the court's attention. And costume melodrama and political scheming follows. The Man Who Laughs is nearly 2 hours long, and it feels much longer. The plot spends too much time with characters you don't care about. Blankanova's character is unlikable. At the end of the film, there's a sudden turn to swashbuckling action, which feels very tacked on and out of place. However, like Hunchback of Notre Dame, the central performance of this movie saves it. Conrad Veidt, who was also in Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, plays Gwynplaine, and he conveys so much with his face and his eyes. Veidt really had a talent for silent cinema. He had the face for it. And it's a good thing that it's such a good performance, because Gwynplaine is such a downer of a character. He's really a sad sack. He has this permanent, perpetual smile, but he's always crying. Mary Philbin plays Dea. She also appears in Phantom of the Opera, which we'll be talking about in a minute. She gives a good performance in this one. I do like the moment where she feels Gwynplaine's face for the first time and realizes his deformity, but she loves him anyway. She doesn't care. The Man Who Laughs' most enduring pop culture contribution can be seen in the appearance of the Joker. Bob Finger was inspired by a poster for this movie to create the Joker. It's really no surprise that the makeup would inspire probably Comicdon's most famous villain. Jack Pierce's work is still grotesque and unsettling. It's not really a great movie, but its historical importance outweighs its aesthetic value. Also, there's a dog named Homo in the movie.
In the Phantom of the Opera, Lon Chaney probably went as far as he could go with a horrifying makeup. I mean, he turned his face into what appeared to be a skull, using all kinds of painful tricks and appliances.
After Hunchback of Notre Dame, Universal made a second silent classic with Lon Chaney, and I'm talking, of course, about 1925's The Phantom of the Opera, which is probably the first real Universal monster movie. Phantom of the Opera is not a great movie, but it is a great performance. If you think studio meddling is a modern phenomenon, think again. The 25 version of Phantom suffered from multiple rewrites, reshoots, and recuts. As many as 5 different versions were edited and presented, with love triangles and characters added and discarded. The director of this movie, Rupert Julian, was by all accounts a hack, numerous issues are evident in the final film, such as a scene where Raoul is listening to Christine talk with the Phantom, and there should be a sinister moment, but for some reason he smiles. It doesn't matter because Lon Chaney Sr. holds it all together. Gaston Leroux wrote the original book, Phantom of the Opera, and in that book, Eric the Phantom is an over-the-top villain. He's an assassin, he's a singer, he's a composer, and a musician, and an architect, and a magician, and a trap master, and a ventriloquist. There's just nothing he can't do. And despite these extravagances, what makes Eric fascinating is his love for Christine. He has this desire to redeem himself. He recognizes how evil and loveless he is, but he's desperate for redemption. All of this and more is in Lon Chaney's performance. His body language is authoritative and sinister. A point of his finger, a bend to the elbow, arms crossed, visible evil laugh, it all conveys numerous emotions. One of my favorite shots has his hand spidering into frame from around a curtain. There's no spoken dialogue, obviously, but his body language causes lines that appear in titles like, "Glut your eyes upon my accursed ugliness," to drip with a malicious venom. Why the Phantom is pure evil during numerous scenes. Others show him collapsing under despair and a broken heart. Chaney conveys all of this under extensive makeup is even more impressive. It's a phenomenal performance and resonates nearly 90 years later. Why Chaney's performance is obviously the highlight of the movie, there's other reasons to recommend it. The set and production design is fantastic. The Paris Opera House is an iconic set with a huge amount of detail and character. Eric's lair is beautifully furnished, with Christine's opulent bed being the highlight. The film makes excellent use of shadows. The Phantom appears in silhouette, making demands of Christine, histrionically announcing the drop of the chandelier. Christine's first appearance has her literally appearing like an angel floating out of a heaven stage setting, and her descent into the bowels of the opera house are the descent into Freudian symbolism. All of these are fantastic images, and there's a color sequence at the masquerade where Eric appears in red costume as the Mask of the Red Death, which is another costume they've made a lot of toys and action figures, dolls and things of. And the movie certainly isn't free of the melodramatic conventions of the day. Christine and Raoul's love story, as in the source material, never really sells. Christine comes off as a bit of a fool, and she's pushed around by the men in her life. Like I said, this movie suffered from multiple recuts and re-edits, and the climax really feels clobbered together. After Eric allows Christine to leave with Raoul, suddenly he makes a dramatic turn back to being evil, and he abducts her, throws her in a carriage, and runs off cackling like a supervillain, chased by an angry mob. But even that ending, which is a bit of a misstep, has an incredible moment where the angry mob has surrounded Chaney. He holds up his fist as if he's got a grenade in it, and that causes the crowd to pause, but then he opens up his hand and shows them there's nothing in it, that one last time he's tricked them. Afterwards, they immediately beat him to death and throw his body into the river. Despite any misgivings, The Phantom of the Opera is a classic, without a doubt. See it if you haven't seen it, goddammit.
A ray from this nebula will be caught here and electrically transferred to the projector in my laboratory. More power than man has ever possessed. Power to heal, power to destroy. You're poisoned, and everyone I touch is poisoned.
If he touches anyone,
they die.
Now we're jumping ahead a bit to the sound era. If you're talking about classic Universal horror, eventually you have to talk about Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi. They're both in this next movie on my list here. From 1936, The Invisible Ray. The movie was initially released on DVD in a set called the Bela Lugosi Collection, which was kind of ironically named because Lugosi co-starred with Karloff in all but one of the movies on that set. I owned it for years, but I honestly don't think I'd ever watched The Invisible Ray before recently. And if I had, I'd forgotten almost everything about the movie. The Invisible Ray is very fun sci-fi horror hybrid. The movie has a fantastically gothic opening with a group of old scientists led by Lugosi gathering in an old castle on a dark and stormy night. Boris Karloff shows his audience the history of an asteroid hitting the Earth by reflecting rays off of the star Andromeda, which is something I don't think is possible. But it's hard to go wrong when you have Boris Karloff narrating a series of surreal astral images. A new element has fallen somewhere in Africa. Boris Karloff's scientist discovers it, and then his other scientist friends screw him over, essentially. This asteroid element has the unfortunate side effect of giving Karloff a cancer that will eventually kill him. But before it kills him, it gives him the ability to kill other people just by touching them. Those scenes in Africa do have some mildly racist elements of very stereotypical African natives. Unfortunately, that just comes with the time period. Karloff starts out as a relatively sane character, but after discovering this element, immediately becomes crazy. Right after discovering this asteroid, he makes a death ray with it. And another reason Karloff's character is pissed off is because because his much younger wife is in love with another guy. A lot of setup to go through. The Invisible Ray is a half an hour in before we actually get to the movie's main point. It's not too much of a problem, though, because the film is pretty well paced. The movie makes a second major location shift to Paris. And once in Paris, Karloff can get down to the business of killing those who have wronged him with his new powers. The main pleasure of the Invisible Ray is seeing Boris Karloff play an over-the-top villain. The movie says that the radiation drives him crazy. Having Karloff scream about thieves is definitely a fun moment. There are several nice touches in the second half of the movie. When Karloff kills one of his victims, it leaves an irradiated handprint on their skin. Every time Boris kills one of the people who have wronged him, he destroys one of 6 statues that are standing outside of his hotel room. Usually Lugosi played the villain, but in this one he's playing the hero, but don't expect him to last until the end of the movie. And the ending is pretty unexpected. The film has a decent surprise at the end that I won't spoil. Maybe The Invisible Ray demands a little more from its viewers than most 30s horror movies do, but I think it's a satisfying thriller. I had a lot of fun with The Invisible Ray. Definitely see The Invisible Ray if you're a fan of Boris Karloff.
Recently, newspapers and magazines everywhere carried an amazing story. Reporters saw Dr. Manley Hall hypnotize actor Lugosi to give reality to a scene in Black Friday. Horror-struck, they witnessed the hypnotized actor's mortal agony as Lugosi actually experienced the terror of suffocating to death in a closet.
Let me out, please! I'm suffocating!
Next movie on my list here is 1940's Black Friday. Notice a lot of these old films from the 30s and 40s would sometimes mash different genres up just to see what interesting results they could get. 1940's Black Friday is definitely an example of that. This is a sci-fi crime film that definitely slips into horror as it progresses. The story revolves around a professor of English literature and his best friend, who is a brain surgeon played by Boris Karloff. This vicious gangster is driving his car when he's shot by his gang members who have betrayed him. And this injury will render him a paraplegic. But when he gets shot, he crashes his car into this English professor, causes a fatal brain injury in the guy. Boris Karloff is a budding mad scientist in this movie, and he gets the idea to transfer the gangster's brain, which is healthy, but his body is crippled, into his professor friend's body, who is brain dead, but the body is healthy. In most brain swap stories, the transplanted brain immediately takes over the new body, and it creates a total personality shift. In Black Friday, it works something like a split personality. Red Cannon, admittedly badass name of the 40s gangster, takes over the professor's body while he sleeps. With this new body, he proceeds to seek vengeance on his former partners in crime. At first, Boris Karloff's character is justifiably horrified by the murders, but that's until he learns that the gangster has nearly $1 million hidden away and is willing to share. That's right, kids, the real source of evil here is greed. Black Friday is primarily a crime film with a science fiction gimmick. There's definitely some stuff here to interest horror nerds. The movie has a definite Jekyll and Hyde vibe with the way the benevolent professor shifts into the personality of the evil gangster. Once the gangster's brain has taken over the professor's body, he systematically murders his former gang members. It makes the movie feel a bit like a prototype for a slasher film. There's definitely a focus on the method of murder. There's a moment where Red Cannon strangles his girlfriend, and his back is facing the camera, so you can't see him killing the girl, but you can hear her scream, which is pretty grisly for 1940. Boris Karloff's character is initially well-meaning, but slowly develops the attributes of a mad scientist as he attempts to manipulate the murderous monster he's created. Sadly, Bela Lugosi is once again wasted in a small supporting part. He should have been cast as normal professor who transforms into this murderous gangster. He would have been a natural fit for, but for some reason instead he plays one of Cannon's lieutenants and isn't given too much to do. His death scene is also embarrassing. He's locked in a cellar and suffocated. Black Friday wraps up on a real satisfying note. The film score is melodramatic, and it overuses the newspaper swirling into the camera to show you a headline gag that you see parodied so often. Other than that, Black Friday is a solidly entertaining, if minor, entry in the Universal horror cycle. If you haven't seen it, definitely check it out.
Our movie this week is simply electrifying. The young man who actually did a carnival act with electricity may have gained his immunity from his repeated exposure to it. And Dr. Lawrence's shady associate, Dr. Regas, decides to make the guy, one Dynamo Dan, his guinea pig and keeps feeding him higher and higher voltages. All I can say is more power to him. Regas converts him into an electrically powered zombie who will do his sinister bidding as Lon Chaney Jr. becomes a terrifying man-made monster.
Twice now in this episode, I've talked about Lon Chaney Sr., but this wouldn't be a real episode about Universal Horror if his son, Lon Chaney Jr., didn't eventually come up. The Wolfman, definitely Chaney's most famous film, was directed by a guy named George Wagner. Before Lon Chaney Jr. and George Wagner made The Wolfman, they made a movie from 1941 called Man-Made Monster. Man-Made Monster is clearly a test run for The Wolfman. It's a relatively typical mad scientist movie, but I've always been a fan of this one. This movie gets right to the story. Chaney plays Dynamo Dan the Electric Man, a sideshow performer whose shtick is surviving electric jolts. His circus crew is on a bus that then crashes into a phone line, is the first scene in the movie, and this crash kills everybody on board except for Dan. His survival is attributed to his ability to survive and absorb electricity. He gets asked to be studied by scientists. The very jolly, energetic Dan is more than willing and takes it all in stride. He makes friends with a guy named Dr. Lawrence and his daughter, and even gets close to the family dog. He attracts the attention of Dr. Lawrence's evil, power-mad assistant, played by Lionel Atwill, who usually played evil assistants. Atwill's experiments subject Dan to intense electrical charge. This saps his pep and personality and turning him into a subservient zombie, while providing him with destructive electric powers. The first to go is Dr. Lawrence, of course, because Atwill has to kill off his rival. Dynamo Dan ends up in jail for that murderer. They try to execute him in the electrical chair, but that doesn't work out, and he goes rampaging across the country in a kind of silly-looking rubber suit. Man-Made Monster is unambitious stuff, but a seasoned monster kid like me found a lot to like. Chaney gives a very good performance. As in The Wolfman, his character starts out as a lighthearted, happy guy. Dynamo Dan is reduced by repeated electrical shocks to an emotional slug, and Lon has no problem playing both. And Chaney's best moment, port drink reduces him to agonized yelling and tears. Reportedly, Lon Chaney always liked to have a moment in his movies where he cried. Atwill is at his evil best, most notably in a scene where he corners the movie's damsel in distress, tells her his entire plan, and then threatens to kill her. This has to be one of the easiest monster makeups of Lon Chaney's career. Glowing effects applied to his face and hands, and that's pretty much it. Dynamo Dan is a distinctly tragic monster. He really has no control over the murders and violence that he commits. After his inevitable end, that dog that he made friends with earlier goes up to his dead body and rests its head on his chest. Aww. As a test run for an iconic horror classic, Man-Made Monster certainly proved Lon Chaney and George Wagner could be a winning team. Their next movie is head and shoulders above this one, but this is a toasty piece of horror fan comfort food.
A nasty doctor turns a man into a monster in search of human hearts.
What would anybody want with just a guy's heart?
And revenge. It's the Mad Ghoul.
Another reoccurring actor in the Universal monster movies of the 40s that I haven't talked about yet is George Zucco. George Zucco, like Lionel Atwill, usually played mad scientists or villains. A movie that has Zucco playing a part that is very typical is 1943's The Mad Ghoul. Great title, right? An evil chemistry professor discovers a poison gas that the ancient Aztecs used to create zombies that feed on human hearts, and naturally he immediately uses it on one of his students. As far as ways to create heart-eating zombies go, poison gas seems a smidge impractical. I guess electricity and black magic were both old hat by 1943. The character dynamics in The Mad Ghoul are so simple you could figure them out with the sound off. The Mad Ghoul, Ted, is his name. Evelyn Ankers, another standard presence in the Universal monster movies of the 40s, plays his fiancée, and it's fairly obvious that the evil professor desires her, which is why he picks on poor Ted. Evelyn Ankers' character is a singer, and her pianist is her backup love interest when Ted gets killed, and the actor playing the piano player is Turhan Bey, who you might recognize from The Mummy's Tomb and a couple other Universal films from this era. The supporting cast is pretty good, which makes up for the leading man, David Bruce, who is very stiff, and not just when he's playing an undead ghoul. He's a way better undead ghoul than he is a normal person. The Mad Ghoul has a super hacky script. There's a required speech about how Zuko's mad scientist is meddling in God's domain. The shambling, monosyllabic ghoul is decidedly unthreatening, and the makeup consists of streaks of dark face paint. Despite that, the film has a moment or two. Obviously, the Mad Ghoul wouldn't be a ghoul unless he was a grave robber, and there are some fairly atmospheric sequences of grave robbing that are heavy on the fog, and you know I love fog. There's a clever scene where a police officer tries to get the drop on the grave robbers by hiding in a casket, and that doesn't go well for him. The monster is something like a cross between Jekyll and Hyde and Frankenstein. Ted is a normal guy until his next heart transplant wears off and he becomes a shambling corpse in a suit again. The climax has the monster meeting his end on a stage in front of hundreds of people, which is at least memorable. The evil professor's final fate has a nicely ironic tone to it. The Mad Ghoul has a little bit of a following. Universal re-released it on VHS in the 90s as part of their Universal Monsters Classic Collection. It's not particularly notable, but I can see why classic horror fans would enjoy this movie.
Here is all you've ever wanted in entertainment in one superb show. Here is matchless story, suspenseful, terrifying, never so thrillingly presented. Here in breathtaking Technicolor is superb spectacle and splendor and romance. Here is a chorus of 100 voices, a ballet of 100 dancers, a cast of 1,000. Claude Rains as the Phantom of the Opera.
Earlier in the podcast, I talked about the most famous silent version of Phantom of the Opera from the 20s. In 1943, Universal remade Phantom of the Opera in blazing Technicolor with elaborate costumes of rich gore. 1943's The Phantom of the Opera is a big budgeted affair. The studio was obviously looking less for chills and more for Oscars, two of which it got. On one hand, it definitely makes sense to remake Phantom of the Opera in sound. Opera is right there in the title, and the previous version was silent. The emphasis is clearly more on the opera than the Phantom of the. The story has really changed a lot. The Phantom is given a tragic backstory. He doesn't start out as a murdering, obsessive psychopath. Instead, he's a kindly aging violinist. When his music is stolen, he rather abruptly flies into a homicidal rage and gets a splash of acid in the face, goes down into the sewers, and becomes the Phantom of the Opera. In this version, the Phantom's played by Claude Rains. Christine is played by Susanna Foster, and there was a large age difference between the two of them. Perhaps for that reason, the Phantom's obsession with Christine changes from a romantic one to a paternal one. The film never outright says Eric the Phantom is Christine's father, but is heavily implied. Because the year was 1943, a love triangle is still necessary. Raoul is reimagined as a Paris police detective, and now he has to compete for Christina's attention with the opera company's baritone. The focus in this version is definitely on music and comedy. There are lengthy opera sequences, all presented in their original language, with many fancy costumes and choreography. The movie basically is a musical. Some broad comedy between Raoul and Anatole. Their mutual vying for Christine's affection is usually played for humor. And I do like that at the end, Christine doesn't pick either of her male love interests. The reason to recommend the 43 version of Phantom of the Opera to horror fans is Claude Rains, who is excellent. There are problems with the character as written. His transition from gentle old man to homicidal maniac comes out of nowhere. But once Rains gets that famous scratchy voice behind the mask, the movie improves considerably. He certainly cuts a sinister figure. One of the most famous scenes in Phantom of the Opera is the chandelier dropping. The 25 version of the story, the chandelier drop, is actually not a memorable moment, but it definitely is in this version. This version of Phantom of the Opera was a big box office success, and a sequel was greenlit. The ending deliberately sets that up. Eric the Phantom is buried in a landslide underneath of the opera house. Before the film ends, you can see the rocks shifting a little bit, suggesting he's still alive under there. There were some scheduling conflicts with Claude Rains, and he didn't come back for the sequel, which was then rewritten as a standalone film with Boris Karloff called The Climax, which is also a very forgettable Technicolor movie.
Creature of evil, running amok, blazing a trail of fear-crazed horror. From the jungle's most guarded secret comes this amazing story of a captive wild woman, torn between the mad cravings of animal blood and the longing for human love. A woman whose jungle instincts give her sinister power over man and beast.
And suppose your experiment does succeed. What will you have? A human form with animal instincts.
In the mid-40s, Universal was making a lot of low-budget monster movies. You could tell that they were eager to build just about any character into a franchise. There's a classic Universal Monsters character that is a subject of a trilogy of films that is often overlooked and forgotten about. I'm talking about Paula the Ape Woman. All three of the Paula the Ape Woman movies are strictly on the B level, and none of them are really that good, but I have to admit, I do sort of like the idea of Paula the Ape Woman. The first movie the character appeared in was 1943's Captive Wild Woman. Premise is purely ridiculous. An animal trainer brings a batch of new animals to a circus after a trip around the world, and among them is a huge female gorilla named Sheila. The animal trainer's girlfriend has a sister who is currently being treated for some sort of unspecified glandular condition. Her doctor ends up being a mad scientist played by John Carradine. He steals Sheila, the female gorilla, and pumps her full of the sister's blood. This process somehow causes the female gorilla to transform into a beautiful human woman named Paula, and Paula soon finds work at the circus because she has psychic control over the animals. Predictably, Paula develops an attachment to the animal trainer and doesn't appreciate him continuing to love his girlfriend. In her rage, Paula transforms into a were-gorilla of some type. The most uncomfortable thing about Captive Wild Woman is the animal footage. Large portions of the film are built around real-life animal trainer Clyde Beatty dealing with lions and tigers. Beatty is thanked in the opening credits, and it's very obvious whenever he swaps out for Milburn Stone, who's the actor playing the part. This movie was made in 1943, so when you see lions and tigers biting biting, clawing, and fighting each other, there's no doubt that they actually just had a lion and a tiger fight each other. Animal rights advocacy was not a thing that existed yet. If that makes you uncomfortable, you will not enjoy Captive Wild Woman. It's really no wonder the lions and tigers are so upset, because they spend most of the movie in very small, uncomfortable cages. It's sad stuff. The cast is the main reason to watch Captive Wild Woman. John Carradine effortlessly plays the mad scientist, which is a type of character he would play many times in the 40s. Evelyn Anchor is here again. Paula the Ape Woman is played by the singularly named Aquanetta. Can't get much of an impression of her acting ability. She's lovely to look at, and her intense stare is certainly captivating. Unfortunately, the were-ape makeup is a very small part of the movie. It's only in one sequence, but it's definitely memorable. The plot is totally ridiculous, and the ending is hugely anticlimactic. And after a very disappointing conclusion, the movie caps it off with an utterly ridiculous voiceover talking about how the scientist once again meddled in God's domain. When Mystery Science Theater was airing on the Sci-Fi Channel, that show made fun of a lot of Universal movies from the 40s. I'm really surprised that this movie wasn't included, because it would make perfect fodder for Mystery Science Theater. Captive Wild Woman, not a terrible movie, but it's not really that good. However, it is much better than either of the sequels.
Nothing says cost-cutting like structuring your entire movie around someone else's, a stolen circus gorilla, which transforms the ape into Paula Dupre, exotic, mysterious, sexy, played by the so-called Venezuelan bombshell Aquanetta. Jack Pierce's ape girl makeup is top-notch.
The first sequel to Captive Wild Woman was 1944's Jungle Woman. When so many of these 40s movies have little continuity between them, it's refreshing to see a sequel that doesn't rewrite or cheat. All the primary characters from Paula the Ape Woman Part 1 are brought back, along with their original actors. Aquanetta, of course, returns, but so does Milburn Stone and Evelyn Anchors. Their parts are just cameos, but it is nice they bothered to show up. Jungle Woman has a framing device. A mad doctor is on trial for murdering a woman. In flashback, he and his witnesses explain their story, and the grand tradition of the Mummy sequels, this movie opens with 10 minutes of stock footage from the previous film. J. Carroll Nate, who is another reoccurring actor of the period, plays a new character who is hastily inserted into the original footage. At one point, two characters have a stock footage fuel flashback within the flashback. The gist is, after Sheila the gorilla was shot, Nace's mad doctor character bought the body and discovered that she was still miraculously breathing. To save money on sets, Nace's character also buys the sanitarium from the first movie. Without explanation, Sheila the gorilla morphs into Paula the woman. The movie is such a low-budget affair that it doesn't even have any new scenes of a guy in a gorilla suit. In the first movie, Paula the Ape Woman didn't speak, and in this one, she does. Aquanetta was not that good of an actress, unfortunately. All her lines are shouted in a monotone. She immediately falls in love with a new male lead, who in this movie is an equestrian. This character, of course, already has a girlfriend, which provides a new target for Paula the Ape Woman. And there are scenes of her crush and his girlfriend canoodling in a boat, which Paula then overturns. There's no actual monster action in Jungle Woman. Paula only wears her were-ape makeup at the very end. For these reasons and more, Jungle Woman is an incredibly dry, slow-paced affair. It feels much longer than its very short, hour-long runtime. Something that connects all of the Universal monsters. No matter how murderous or inhumane they may be, each one has a relatable, all-too-human desire, usually for love and understanding. Even though all the movies are crappy, Paula the Were-Gorilla shares that defining characteristic. She only wants love, and has the bad habit of falling for guys that are already taken. If the films weren't such micro-budgeted, thinly written fares, the character could have been iconic.
Where are you keeping the ape woman?
Right over here. You want to see her?
Yeah.
Now, since Aquanetta had left Universal by the time this movie was made, see, she had been sent to Mexico as one of Hollywood's ambassadors by President Roosevelt, and she made various connections there and wanted to stay there, so she got out of her contract. And Paula Dupre is played this time out by Vicki Lane.
Which brings us to the concluding chapter in Universal's most underachieving monster saga. The Paula the Ape Woman trilogy ended with 1945's The Jungle Captive. Unlike Jungle Woman, The Jungle Captive doesn't feature any stock footage. Actually, it has a little setup. During a morgue robbery, the attendant mentions an ape woman without disclosing her origin. If the viewer wasn't familiar with Paula's previous exploits, odds are good they'd think this is a standalone feature. Anyway, the plot. A mad scientist obsessed with reviving corpses gets his henchmen to steal Paula the Ape Woman's body. For some reason, the scientist is determined to revive her. To do so, he kidnaps a young female nurse who, along with her fiancé, believes the doctor to be benevolent. He transfers the living girl's blood into the dead were-gorilla, which somehow brings Paula back to life. The first half hour of this hour-long film is spent on this, meaning the central monster doesn't do anything until the movie's halfway over. It becomes apparent to the doctor very quickly that the newly resurrected Paula is practically brain dead and requires a gray matter transplant. Gee, it's a good thing he's got this young girl of the exact same physical type right here, isn't it? Once again, Paula the Ape Woman proves to be an ineffective ineffectual monster. She breaks out of the house once and kills a dog. That's the only thing the character does in this movie. The main villain's henchman is played by Rondo Hatton, who is an actor I will talk about more later, and his character is more proactive. He frequently goes out and murders people for the doctor. Paula's origin is retconned quite a bit. Originally, she was a gorilla that got a human thyroid, leading to the transformation. Paula is now a gorilla with human brain. Perhaps this was done to account for a new actress playing the part. Aquanetta was wooden in the previous two movies, but she was better than this actress, Vicky Lane, who does nothing but stand around and blankly stare. By the end of the movie, the clueless boyfriend and the asshole detectives finally put two and two together. Body count spikes considerably when the servant turns against the doctor, as is usually the case. Despite being slow and clumsy, I liked the Jungle Captive more than Jungle Woman. At the very least, you actually get to see the monster in this one. I'll defend Rondo Hatton's acting. He is gruff, but you can glean some emotion under his ugly mug. If he had lived longer, monosyllabic henchman is a part you know he would have played more. None of the Paula the Ape-Woman movies are good, but some are less terrible than others. Maybe the novelty of a female monster was enough to get 3 pictures out of this premise. Maybe in the 40s Universal would just equalize any of their B flicks. Either way, it's no surprise the character remains the studio's most obscure creation.
Obviously, Marcel is out to immortalize the features of our film's leading man, Rondo Hatton. Rondo has a somewhat tragic real-life story. He never intended to be Hollywood's monster without makeup. It was during his military career when, in a battle outside Paris, Rondo breathed poison gas, which doctors suspected triggered the onset of acromegaly, a disease that affects the pituitary glands, causing the victim's skeletal structure to become disfigured with odd growth of the face, hands, and feet. It seemed Universal had plans for him as a horror star, casting him in Jungle Captive, then in The Spider-Woman Strikes Back, and then this movie, House of Horrors.
Now, I mentioned Rondo Hatton. He developed acromegaly, actually a genetic pituitary condition. He has a very large brow and jaws and big hands and ears. This condition was actually killing Rondo and would eventually end his life prematurely. But before that happened, Universal had the crazy idea to get this deformed guy to star in a couple of horror movies. They promoted him as the monster that didn't need makeup, which is exploitive, no doubt. The movie that really launched Rondo's brief career was 1946's House of Horror. I'm a big fan of House of Horror. There's something effortlessly charming about this movie. The script is predictable. It's about a struggling sculptor named Marcel who has all of his potential sales destroyed by critics' bad reviews. In a moment of suicidal despair, he walks over to the docks with the intent of throwing himself into the water. Instead, he winds up rescuing the Creeper, a man with wildly exaggerated facial features and a bad tendency to break women's backs with his bare hands. The vicious serial killer is eternally grateful to the starving artist. Before too long, he decides to pay him back by murdering the critics that have destroyed his career. There's also a subplot involving a feisty female art critic, a hunky hero who spends the entire movie painting a picture of a woman with a tennis racket. Why do I find this movie so endearing despite its formulaic script? The movie actually has an interesting look to it. When the action isn't set inside Marcel's studio apartment, it's set on the streets of Manhattan. The entire movie was shot on sound stages, and it creates this pulpy, almost dreamlike tone to the story. The film has an urban setting and a complete lack of supernatural elements, and frequently features bad men in fedoras casting shadows on walls. It makes this feel a bit more like a film noir than a horror movie. That mean-spirited tone extends to the story as well. Despite the spunky art critic lady and her illustrator boyfriend ostensibly being the heroes, the focus is squarely on Marcel and the Creeper. Rondo Hatton's character, the Creeper, is never given any Freudian excuse for his desire to kill. He just likes strangling people to death. You're actually able to read a bit of gay undercurrents into the movie. Marcel repeatedly calls the Creeper's face beautiful. These two oddballs seem to accept each other up front, at least until the end anyway, when they inevitably turn on each other. The movie is effective as a horror film as well. The scene of the Creeper stalking his first female victim makes nice use of shadows and sound. When the victim turns to face the Creeper, her cigarette drops out of her mouth in shock, which is a nice touch. The later scene of the killer claiming the blonde model is surprisingly bleak and brutal. Rondo is definitely a cult figure, more because of his life story than any of his movies. Hatton actually died before either of his solo starring vehicles could be released. Rondo is frequently criticized for his acting, and no doubt he didn't have much talent. All of his lines are delivered in a gruff monotone. Still, there is a certain naturalistic charm to Rondo's acting. The Creeper character is in a line with a number of murderous, deformed, simpleton characters like Lenny from Of Mice of Men. I do like the rest of the cast. Martin Koslek plays Marcel. Koslek is another actor that showed up in a couple of Universal horror movies at the time. Maybe the main reason I like this movie, its simplistic themes resonate very easily. You have a frustrated artist striking out an uncaring world. That's a classic story. This would be a pretty good candidate for a remake, though I don't know who you would cast as Rondo Hatton in this day and age. I don't know if House of Horrors is a great movie, but if you like 40s monster movies and you haven't seen it already, you should probably at least give it a look.
Stay away from me.
I won't hurt you.
No. No, stay away.
That creeper guy murdered somebody again last night.
Scared to death, like every other woman in town.
I presume you refer to creeper murders?
Chemicals might affect certain glands and nerves. And if they did, his features would never be normal again.
This is what you and Clip did to me.
Like I said, Rondo Hatton starred in 2 movies for Universal, the second of which is 1946's The Brute Man, which is actually a prequel to House of Horrors and explains the origin of the Creeper. Before he was a murderer, he was a promising college athlete who had a crush on his best friend's girlfriend. Following a cruel science prank involving poison gas, Hal Moffat mutates into Rondo Hatton. No explanation is provided for his sudden tendency to strangle people to death beyond the repeated mention of his short temper. Anyway, because of all the murdering, the Creeper is on the run from the cops. He meets and befriends a blind woman who naturally is not repulsed by his hideous appearance. That's pretty much it as far as the story goes. There's not a lot to The Brute Man. The movie has trouble filling even a short hour-long runtime. A lot of screen time is filled with police room banter and repeated shots of police officers talking into radios. The Brute Man is the red-headed stepchild of Universal's horror cycle. Rondo Hatton, like I said, died before the movie could be released, and the studio was uncomfortable releasing the film so close to his death. Combined with a new studio-wide mandate to halt production on all B-rated horror films, Universal sold The Brute Man to a Poverty Row distributor. If you're inclined to believe that Rondo's entire acting career was somewhat exploitive, The Brute Man is definitely the nadir of that exploitation. In real life, while House of Horror had atmosphere and some thrills, The Brute Man is bland in execution with flat direction and an underwritten screenplay. Even then, it has a moment or two worth recommending. Like Paula the Ape Woman before him, the Creeper solidifies his standing among the Universal monsters. It's the budding romantic relationship with the blind piano player that motivates the monster's killing in the film's latter half. The Creeper only wants love and understanding, for people to not reject him based on his appearance alone. Even if the rest of the script is thin, that theme resonates deeply with any monster fan. Rondo's delivery is still awkward, but he gives a better performance this time than he did in House of Horrors. The script gives him more to do. I suspect if his illness hadn't ended his life early, he could have developed into a decent character actor. The blind girl is played by Jane Addams, who also appeared in House of Dracula as the nurse with the hunchback. I'm not the first one to speculate that a film about Rondo Hatton's life would be more interesting than any of the movies he actually starred in, and even though his appearance in the genre was brief, it left a lasting impact. A website called the Classic Horror Awards, their award is a bust of Rondo Hatton. People remember Rondo. If you're interested in classic horror and you've seen all the established films, maybe you should seek out the Creeper duo with Rondo Hatton. Well, I'm all out of movies to talk about here, so that concludes this episode of the Bangers and Mash Show. Hopefully the sound quality here isn't too bad. I recorded this in a different location than where we usually record, so that's why it sounds different. I really am sorry that JD couldn't be here for this. He will definitely be on the next episode, I guarantee you that. If you want to email the Bangers and Mash Show, you may do so at bangersandmash88@yahoo.com. It's been a while since we've gotten an email. The show has a Facebook group, just search the Bangers and Mash Show. Until next time, stay creepy. Mr. Bangers out.
Is long, parola, paroli. There'll be no music in the tomb, so sing with joy and down with gloom. Tonight the new wine is in bloom. Paro, paro, parolo. Tonight we toast our happy host, parola, paroli, parola, paroli. For he's the man we love the most, parola, paroli. Parola, paroli. His barrel-bellied dipper lip, for drinking wine he's well equipped, but where his chest it must have slipped. Paro, paro, parolo. The wine tonight is nobly blessed. Parola, paroli. by such a lady and her guest, Parola Parolin. To them I toast, come drink with me, that may they ever happy be, and may they live eternally. Parola, come one and all and sing a song. Parola Parolin, for life is short, but death is long.